Hi, everyone, and welcome to this webinar series. It's wonderful to see so many familiar names as you're registering and signing up and ending up in our attendee box. It's really great to see you. Just want to let you know that we are very excited to be revamping the Care2 webinar program. And this is the premiere of our revamped webinar program. So we're going to do our best to mitigate any technology issues, but if there's any audio or video issues that you might be having, please go ahead and chat in the chat box. And our wonderful webinar wizard, Emma, my coworker, Emma, will be able to answer any questions that you might have. Some common questions we get are, will the webinar be recorded? Yes, and we're recording right now. We will follow up with a recording in your email. We will also have a link to the report that we're going to be talking about today, the Measuring People Power report, that you can also get your own copy if you haven't already read it. I think we're just going to give it a few more seconds as I see people are still filing in. Again, it's really great to see your names. And I also want to let you know that during this webinar, at any point, if you have any questions, please chat your questions in the chat box. Now, I don't know if you've set up your video so that you can see me as I'm chatting, but I'm going to indicate where I think the chat box is. Give me a yes or no if it's on this side for your screen, depending on how you've set it up. But go ahead and chat in the chat box. Any questions that you have, we'll be collecting them and giving them to our experts near the end of the webinar. Okay, as we are recording, I'd like to get started. So welcome everyone. I'm your host, Claire Kerr. I'm the Canadian Country Director here at Care2. I work with organizations who want to reach new supporters on digital channels. And I also teach digital strategies for nonprofit organizations at George Brown College here in Toronto, where it is actually snowing, folks. Right outside my window, there's snowflakes. So.
Right.
Wait, April storms, those of us, the northern folks, you know what it's like, but looking for good weather someday when we will all be able to be together. I'm really looking forward to seeing a lot of you in person in the future. I already mentioned that Emma's our wonderful assistant who will be able to help you out with anything technical related or any questions about the webinar format. So if someone happens to mention a website or you see an email address or something like that that you would like reiterated, please just chat and let us know, and Emma will be able to help you out personally. But I am very excited to talk about this topic because it's a topic that I think that we have had requested a lot. How do we measure the impact of all the things we do that aren't necessarily transactional or quantitative? So volunteering, activism, engagement in our communities, that's a big question that we have in the nonprofit sector. And the Measuring People Power report really aimed to address all the things that we're doing to assess the value of those activities. So I really want you to take a look at the report if you haven't had a chance. Here's the link up on the screen. It was produced by MobLab, Do Big Good, Greenpeace, Care2, and 10 other organizations. And this survey was of more than 500 social change practitioners from and leaders from about 177, I think it was, different organizations around the world. So there's a lot of value in this survey and in this report, and we're going to talk about the insights from it in this webinar. But first, I would like to introduce you to our wonderful experts today we have on the call. And I believe that, you know, this is going to be great to check out the recording and see what the video looks like. I believe that you will be able to see them when they're talking, or you could probably choose gallery view. Again, I'm pointing towards something that I'm hoping is existing on your screen, and you can see everyone's pictures. But we're going to start out with introducing Mer Joyce of Do Big Good. She is the founder and principal of the Seattle-based impact measurement firm Do Big Good. I hope it is not snowing in Seattle right now. She has over a decade of global experience in the intersection of research, innovation, and campaigning. So she has deployed a lot of creative tactics to tackle the root causes of the root causes of lack of change in order to impact change in the nonprofit sector. And I also want to point out that she edited the book Digital Activism Decoded, So I've got to get my copy, or maybe I can go straight to the source and get a copy. And she was the new media operations manager for President Obama's 2008 campaign. So welcome, Mary. We're just like, for those who are muted, we're just kind of waving. And next, I would like to welcome Michael Silberman, the Global Director of Mobilization Lab. They train and coach advocacy campaigners and their organizations to leverage people power, the heart of what we're talking about today. And they Michael was also at Greenpeace in 2011, and he guided them to think and retool campaigning for the modern era. Welcome, Michael. And all of these organizations, we have plenty of extra resources for you at the end of the webinar. And next up, Joseph White. Welcome, Joe, the Engagement Support Manager in the Global Engagement Department at Greenpeace. He has over 10 years experience working at marketing agencies in the charitable sector in the UK and joined Greenpeace International 5 years ago. He helps campaigns and national offices to understand their audiences, engage them to respond, and then deepen that engagement over time to build meaningful relationships that create impact and maximize return on investment, all the great stuff that we're talking about today. So this report featured 500 people, insights from 177 organizations around the world, and Joe, you were one of them. So I think that we would really like to start off with an impact story from you. Tell us a little bit about your experience when it comes to assessment and understanding the value of engagement.
Thank you. I think it's a bit nerve-wracking being described as an expert in this, because I would see myself more as a very interested party who's excited to see this conversation happen in the sector.
Too bad. You have 10 years experience. That makes you an expert.
Okay.
10 years experience or 10,000 hours, right? You gotta take it.
It's got to be about that by now. I think one of the things that's really exciting about this report is seeing it come to life. And I remember being at the meeting in 2018 where the seeds of this were initially discussed, and to actually see it kind of come to fruition in such a large way is really exciting. And hopefully this is just the start. I think before coming to Greenpeace, a lot of my experience was in fundraising. And I think because that is tangible, it has that simple to measure aspect to it, and is also tied up in the money. It's really easy to see, in some degrees, we put this much in, we get this much out. And I think our metrics have become more sophisticated as we start to move away from the direct amount we raise and really start to think about it from a relationship point of view, start to think about lifetime value and how much we can invest in someone and how much we can build that relationship with someone over time, because we will get that money back. And I think when I came to Greenpeace and came to an organization that was much more campaigning led, I think firstly, it was a surprise to me how much we still needed to get that relationship and engagement thinking embedded in our fundraising and really start to move towards these kind of lifetime value measures. But I think it was really surprising how much that wasn't carrying across necessarily into our campaigning audiences, and how we would be really keen to get someone to do the hand raiser or to do that initial action, but linking that up, building that into someone who didn't just want to support one campaign or one initiative in one moment, but thinking about someone who wants to change the world and they're seeing Greenpeace as a way to do that. I think I was really surprised, and I think we've still got a long way to go, but I think reports like the one we're discussing today help start that development. I think it was also quite a nice thing to see that there isn't a magic bullet. Don't like using the word bullet, but need to come up with a better way of saying that. But there isn't this metric out there that people aren't using. It's going to be hard, and it is about finding proxies for impact, because impact is so difficult to measure. But one of the things it's helped inform at Greenpeace is starting to think about lifetime engagement value and engagement scoring, and how we can put different proxies on the actions that people are taking to think about how likely they are not just to take another action with us, but to take an action that has meaning and is connected to our theories of change, and hopefully will create that long-lasting impact in the world. And how can we find ways to give people confidence to invest in people-powered initiatives? Because we know from some of the fundraising work that we've seen that people who do more and feel more connected will often stay longer and their value will be greater. And I think seeing how we translate that into the campaigning work we do, and how we give confidence to the budget holders and to our boards to invest in those types of initiatives is really important. And I think hopefully, as I say, this will be the start of a lot of really interesting initiatives and conversations moving forwards. So not an expert, but really happy to have conversations with you about what we can do with this and how we can really use it to help transform the sector and push us forwards.
One of the things that I thought was really intriguing about this report was how many different ways organizations have to put a value to engagement. Lifetime value scoring just being one sort of thing that I think a lot of organizations haven't thought about doing. You think about scoring your donors, you know, but not necessarily scoring activities or impacts or volunteers. So that's just one of many different ways to articulate the impact of engagement. So Michael, I'm actually going to just pass over to you because I know that you have some insights from the report that you'd like to share.
Great. Yeah. So let's see. I will try to make the sharing work. 1 second here.
Chat in the chat box if you are actively assigning a lead score to your donors, but and your volunteers or any of your constituents. I'd like to know that.
Am I sharing?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, this feels like a good place to pick up from Joe. I think, yeah, I can share. Hopefully you've had a chance to flip through the report. We weren't sure if we should call it a report. That sounds like a heavy thing to read, but it's actually like the report is really just a summary of a bigger report. So you can get the whole report if you want all the data and all the numbers. And then this, the thing you saw a screenshot of on Claire's screen a moment ago is the hopefully readable, colorful version that will summarize even better than what I'm about to tell you. But for those of you who have not had a chance, I'm going to give you the highlights just so that we can have a productive or useful, good conversation together in the remaining time, and share a few things that stood out for us. So our belief at MobLab is that the only way we can win in our campaigns and our social justice missions is if we fully enable the potential of what people can do when they're contributing the full spectrum of their skills, their time to our missions. And so, as Joe said, we know how to capture when people are donating to us. We know how to see the numbers go up when more people contribute, and it's wonderful that those numbers are so easy. What we haven't been able to capture as well, and that's the question that got us to this report and this project was figuring out, is there some way to measure all those non-financial contributions, the time, the expertise, the various forms of leadership? And we're seeing that, I think, in abundance right now in this crisis, with the kinds of mutual aid efforts that are popping up everywhere, and seeing and being reminded of the creativity and the contributions that people can make to their communities right now in this moment. But that's the kind of stuff where we were setting out to figure out, is there a way to better measure and communicate internally those sorts of efforts and contributions to our organizations, so that in hopes we can also continue to resource those critical activities. So this is wanted to make sure, I'm just here on behalf of 14 partners who contributed to ensuring that we get to 500 people around the world. and 170 organizations. As Claire said, we were, oops, I'll just jump ahead. To one here. We were lucky that this was able to become a global sample of campaigners and practitioners all around the world. Very few gaps or blind spots in some places you might expect where mobilizing and organizing is extra risky. And we got a great cross section of organizations, of issue areas, and as well as organization size. So from small groups to medium groups to groups that are engaging well over 1 million people. And so what we're trying to measure, we're trying to figure out, we kind of went in, to be perfectly honest, we thought maybe there's this holy grail. We set out to see, is there this holy grail of a measurement that someone out there maybe has been trying that would encompass all three essential parts of what we consider to be necessary for figuring out whether or not you have people power. And here, the three bits are as follows. One, breadth or reach. So our campaigns reaching large numbers of people, inspiring and connecting with many people. Almost every campaign needs that, right? Very few campaigns can get by with just reaching, the 10 people. Maybe there's a strategy that's the case. But we don't just need large numbers. For people power, we need also people committed, right? People willing to make phone calls, to show up, to volunteer, to be creative and to contribute to strategy, to tactics. And of course, all that needs to be ideally connected to impact. And this is where I'm excited to hear more from Mary in a little bit, but all these have to be working in concert, right? So just because we have lots of people on a list doesn't necessarily mean we're going to be achieving that, those. That doesn't necessarily mean strategic power. That might just mean potential power of people who could make noise, but not necessarily towards some specific end that's needed to achieve our social change. So highlights, we found that most people are measuring breadth, and that's great. And that's that first section, right? So in some ways it was actually a little bit surprising because a lot of those breadth metrics are associated with online metrics. And for a while, for a decade, for the last decade, many of us on this call were just working to ensure that people cared about those digital metrics at all, right? And that things like that people had the tools and the skills and the staff and the capacity they needed to figure out if anyone, if the email list was growing or if people were opening those emails and clicking through. And so that's great. We're now at this, it's worth reflecting and maybe pausing that, for people who've been in this field for more than a few years, we're at this new moment where basically everyone knows how to track online metrics, absolute numbers, petition signatures, things like that. So that's great. And also worth noting that more than half of the people in this segment said, we're doing this enough and or too much. We're actually getting to the point where this is happening too much, potentially dangerously so, and potentially getting us into being distracted from these other metrics that we'll come to next and some of these depth metrics. But the risk, we put out a report in the past call about going beyond vanity metrics, and some of these absolute numbers are really important and of course valuable. We need to know how many people are signing up to the list, and they're an essential ingredient to other measures. But the danger when we only look at those attractive numbers, like how many people are following us on social media, they risk distracting us from impact, right? They're exciting to look at, and maybe they can be impressive to certain people, but increasingly we think those numbers don't necessarily equal power. Again, if a lot of people, just because and a lot of groups are being tested right now and don't to find out now as we enter a recession or as people's time gets fractured in a crowded digital landscape, who of those people, of a large number of people on a list, who's going to respond, who's willing to, do those numbers lead to power, or are they simply and people who are willing to take that next step or make a commitment of time and energy, of money, or are they simply just numbers? So that's where we see some limitations. I'm sure there might be some questions we could talk more about what a vanity metric, how do vanity metrics play in. But the next key insight from all this data is that while most people are measuring breadth, fewer have the ability to measure depth well. So depth of people's relationship to one another in a network, in an organization's network, or with the organization, or with the cause, the strength of that connection to the issue or movement itself. And almost everyone had trouble, even though everyone was interested in trying it, most people were interested in depth, they had trouble or struggled to have what they need to measure how breadth and depth interplay to generate progress towards achieving their goals. However, there were some bright spots here. We saw a few opportunities, easy opportunities or immediate opportunities for many groups to be able to improve here. And I'll share one example in a second, but there were several groups that were able to start quantifying the depth of relationships, how engaged supporters were, how connected they are. And there were 5, if you go into the report, there are 5 kind of clusters of approaches, some of them including tracking network ties, for example, like what is the strength of how strong is that is the network, like we were talking about mutual aid networks, right? How strong are the network ties between and among supporters? What is the level of distributed or emergent leadership? So people who are independently motivated to drive elements of a mission or campaign without a lot of direction, or level of engagement, level of willingness to take certain levels of action. And so good news is there's some precedent for this. This doesn't necessarily require a ton of new research or hard work or technologies. Obviously depends on what folks have in place already, but I'll share one example here in a second. The only caveat or note is just that we have to be careful that to not leap to any conclusions that just because we have people who are willing, who are connected or are motivated or willing or have taken actions, that doesn't necessarily, this gets into that strategy question again, right? It doesn't necessarily mean we have power. It means we have potential power. That's maybe potential for more people. That's potential for people to take action in concert with our mission and with an organization. It still requires the right series of other ingredients of a strategy or a campaign or other things. It's not in and of itself power, right? Power has to be kind of applied. So we could dig more into that perhaps, but it's a pretty good, we think it's actually still a decent proxy. It's just not a short definition. So just to illustrate this, we have a case study. You can see this one straight on the website and in the report. The folks at Friends of the Earth Netherlands shared with us, among others, this was just one we highlighted, how they shifted from going from measuring absolute metrics like list size to starting to identify the different leadership attributes that they wanted to see among their network. And so they said, we need to be able to build long-term power to be successful. We need to be able to invest we want people acting on their own or acting as groups, or we need more than a big list to achieve our mission. And therefore, we're going to focus our attention, not our entire team's attention and our organization's attention, not just on recruiting new people, but towards some more nuanced metrics where we're going to look to see, is there evidence of people taking initiative in our network? And that started to force different strategic or internal decisions and shift in the culture internally, where they started asking questions like, hey, do people have what they need to take action? Do we need to support people at each level of our engagement pyramid better and communicate with them differently so that we can continue to sustain and see action at these different levels of depth, not just seeing if people are signing up or unsubscribing? So that's one to dig into more. It's a great example. There were also a final cluster of approaches that emerged that we think are worth more investigation. And I'll share one more example here before I hand over. But the one note that came out in the survey was this question of just quality. How much of this can be done in a quantitative manner? And there's so much qualitative information that emerges when we're talking about volunteers and people power that maybe we can't, maybe just a few people just called the question and said, maybe we just can't quantify it all, right? And so we're going to have to make sure we leave room for qualitative approaches. And obviously there's a scale question there. So depending on how many people you're working with, it can, how much time do you have to capture some of that qualitative data? How do you benchmark it was another obvious concern of, how do you benchmark that across organizations or for the sector? The qualitative can be a little bit, there's some drawbacks to qualitative data, but it was an important flag to bring out. Second question or observation that came up is not too many respondents commented on the diversity, equity, and inclusion principles that were part of or not part of their measurement approaches and frameworks. And I think several of us who were part of the report talked about how these are sorts of things that do in the future we need to be talking about. How do those lenses be baked into the beginning of any measurement framework or practice to make sure when we're talking about measuring what matters, we're taking care to think about who are we listening to, whose data are we capturing or not capturing in these approaches. So final note here is that in this cluster of approaches that we're interested in digging into more, and that may provide you with some inspiration or creativity, things to play with. There were two sets of approaches that we don't think are immediately actionable for everyone, but are particularly interesting. One is, we saw, for example, this group in the UK, this democracy group, come up with a bespoke set of metrics for people power that tied directly to their mission and goals and objectives. So they used something called the transformational index to work backwards from where they were trying to go mission-wise to figure out then what are the activities or kinds of people power they would need, gross summary here, but to what kinds of people power and activities would they need to see to then achieve those results. So that's what we mean by tying people power directly to progress. And then the second interesting approach that we see kind of on the edge here, and potentially very interesting for some people, is capturing value or a return on investment, so to speak. I don't know if that's too crass to phrase it like that, but of people power. And so, great example here from Canada. And since I know I think this is a heavily North American crowd, this group, some of you may know, Equiterre, based in Canada, where they basically figured out they said, how many volunteer hours are coming in, and can we put a number to that, right? Can we put a staff equivalent time and figure out basically what is the equivalent number of staff hours? How much money, how much are we saving? How much in terms of labor are we benefiting from in terms of volunteer people power? So this will be where I pause, but a couple observations about where we go from here. One, as I think anyone here who's been involved in trying to make shifts of any kind at their organizations, these tools and practices are only half the story, right? The metrics, the measures, these different approaches. Going back to, I think what Joe was saying, a lot of this comes down to the culture of what are we talking about on our teams? Like what are we saying matters, right? What kind of, do we value people in our work? And before we even get to this question of exactly how are we going to measure how involved everyone is, we have to have that culture that's going to be interested in it. We need to foster that culture among our colleagues that is saying, as Joe said, we care about the whole contribution of an individual towards our mission, not just their donation, because it's going to all it's a virtuous cycle, or we need to, so there's this cultural component that is as important, we think, as the specific frameworks that have emerged. Two and three, basically, I can merge here. Let's not get overwhelmed by perfection and by finding, trying to replicate exactly one, there was no holy grail. Basically what we found is everyone is trying. There is no perfect option yet. A lot of this is dependent on mission and context. And there are we were thrilled to find that there were a bunch of great starting points and many things like the Friends of the Earth example that people are already doing that we can start replicating and integrating into our work, but we need not have it perfect to make positive steps forward, right? And actually a lot of this, the best examples we saw and heard about came from groups that were actively working together to figure out what is going to work. Maybe like that Unlock Democracy example in the UK, that they were having that collaborative conversation about what are we trying to measure? What are we trying to ultimately do in the world? How do we know if we're making progress towards that? And how do we capture the roles that people are going to play in that work? Because versus keeping that people powered stuff somewhere separate and disconnected from the actual campaign or program work. So hopefully we're hoping this is a bit of a wake-up call. This is the first time we've had anything close to this benchmarking or baseline anywhere in the sector. So we're excited about the potential we hope it has for you to use this as a tool in your work, and in particular to be able to help clarify or make the case for funders, leaders, boards about where we're at, but also the need for that further investment in the time and energy it takes to properly support and resource these people-powered programs and activities. So
thank you, Michael.
I'll leave it there. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you. And we have had so many questions. A lot of what you went through has driven a lot of dialogue. And we got a lot of questions. So what I'm going to do is actually mash a couple of them together, because there are some topics that seem to have really resonated with the audience. And Mary, I really want to pass off one to you. A lot of folks have wondered, Michael had mentioned the difference between pretty metrics and nuance and depth. And a lot of folks have commented that they struggle with how to articulate impact with leadership, or that leadership has expectations that might be more on the attractive metrics side. And because you work so closely with organizations, I would really like to know, how are the organizations that you're working with, what are their expectations around impact reporting when it comes to stakeholders, or the boss who wants to see a chart,
Yeah, thanks. And it was great hearing from you, Michael and Joe. So I guess the first thing I would say about impact is that it is additive. It is a dial, not a light switch. So it's not like nothing, something magic happens, impact. It's that there's a series of dependencies and gradually impact becomes clear, right? Or a supporter moves through a series of conversions where they're contributing more, or they're contributing in different ways, and that converts to something that at the end we call impact. Usually impact means outcome, but really I think impact is part of what's happening at inputs. Input is part of what's happening during activities, during outputs, and finally outcomes. So, and also I guess that engagement with supporters is part of a larger picture of what your organization is trying to do, right? It's part of a larger theory of change. So maybe, a list metrics might be at the open and the wider end of the funnel, but then what are the conversions that you're going through, and then finding metrics to match up with the progress you're trying to make as an organization. So that's how I try to frame impact when I'm talking to organizations or to funders or to clients.
Just wanted to jump in on there and see if we could elaborate a little bit on that. There are all sorts of different ways that illustrate impact that were listed in the report. So we sort of looked at the Equiterre coming up with their own impact report and working backwards. Is that, if you were going to recommend that somebody experiment or start out with a different way of reporting, so maybe this year in the annual report, you're going to do something a little bit different, or this year in communicating to your members, you're going to put together a video or a different format for explaining the work that you do, what would you recommend as a starting point? And when we have had a lot of questions about technology, and I noticed that Michael, in the report, you mentioned that technology has really allowed us to connect better, do better activism, do more stuff on social, reach out to our community members. Has technology impacted the way that we can more easily report back on the stuff that we do? Or is this still going to be a sort of a more like a conversation or more like a discussion than it would be something that you can use a tool to help articulate? Where can we get started with that?
So I can respond, I guess. I feel like you get started with like a theory. I know people maybe not want to hear this, but theory of change. Joe's laughing. Starting with a theory of change of
chat in the chat box if you're laughing too.
What are we trying to do? What's the goal? And then a work backward process of what needs to happen in order for us to move to that goal, and then tying that to what can you observe at each phase of theory of change, and of those observations, what is countable? Those are your metrics, and then think, okay, what's available in terms of a tool that's going to help me capture that? So I feel like often we start with, oh, this is what's on our dashboard. How can this link to strategy? And I think it's hard for it not to lead to confusion. But if you do start with strategy, do a work back process, think about what you can observe, think about counting what you can observe, those are your metrics, and then you can get in what do we have on our dashboard, and things like that.
Who are the important people to be in the room when you're doing this work?
Yes,
Is that a tough question? Because I feel like if you're trying to articulate your impact and you want to convince stakeholders and community members, who needs to be a part of the team?
Yeah, so that's actually a great question. So at Do Big Good, we're very big into participatory design of impact measurement systems. So at the very least, that means the people doing the work are designing the measurement system. So that means the nonprofits, not the foundations. Ideally, it actually also means that beneficiaries, that volunteers, that the people helping make the impact are part of the process. And yeah, so this can look like, a workshop where you say, hey, where are we going? And where do you think, how do we get there, in a structured way, right? But I do think it's really important to engage beneficiaries and partners in helping you determine, not only where you're going, but also what's feasible to collect in terms of data, right? Like maybe people hate e-surveys. So it's like, okay, we want this information from you. How do you want to hear it? And get some feedback from supporters about this is how we'd like to, or I'd fill in a survey for you once a year, but that's it, right? So it's human-centered design, right? So yeah, I think that's really important to coming up with good metrics and just data collection that will actually happen, that people will actually participate in.
And in talking about who to include in this process, a comment was brought up in the chat that was really great. I'll just read it directly. The generosity of contributions are relative to capacity. And are there any thoughts about addressing inequity? In the report, you mentioned one of the shortcomings was how few organizations actually addressed diversity and inclusion when they were thinking about their impact initiatives. So is there a way that we can include more people? Who was left out of this, essentially, and how can we address that?
I mean, I'd be curious from Mary's perspective, I guess, in terms of a lot of the inclusion question I think that came up was from a data perspective, less perhaps of who wasn't included in this report, although of course this was not a perfect sample of the entire universe, but I think the point really came up in the context of how do we ensure, what are the considerations that need to be placed into designing measurement practices or programs that are inclusive and not unintentionally, biasing us towards certain people in ways that is not consistent with our overall justice missions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I tend, I mean, I think it can be helpful to think about demographic groups and representation, or geography and representation. I think often it's easiest to think about who are our beneficiaries, who are we actually working for, right, as an organization, and then how are they informing the way that we measure impact, in effect, measure our effect on them, right? And I think if you measure out into and engage out into your beneficiaries, you are going to end up with a more diverse pool of people, geographically, ethnically, gender-wise. So that's the lens that I use is beneficiaries. You know, the people that are the recipients of impact, and including them seems to be a pretty logical step.
When I was reading the report, you discussed the transformational index, which actually I hadn't come across before. It wasn't used at any nonprofit that I had worked for before. And you had a quote from Rachel Collinson, which I thought was great, which I'll read. "A measure is good if it's precise, practical, and playful." I thought that that was really great. But what does precise, practical, and playful mean to you? What does that mean to you, Joe?
So I think not to repeat Mary, but I think a lot of it is that it links back to the theory of change. And I think often we want to measure everything that someone can do, but actually when we're thinking about impact, it is really important that we are thinking about how this will, for Greenpeace, how this will change the world. And often people will do something because they think it will lead to that somewhere further down the line in this imaginary way, but we don't connect the dots, we don't measure that. So we end up doing something because of what it might be, not because of what it is. And I think it's important that if we're going to do that, we measure it in the correct way. I think one of my colleagues at Greenpeace, who actually runs a lot of the kind of the systems and technology thinking, says that if you don't measure what you value, then you come to value what you measure. And I think that's really important, because we need to be driving those KPIs, and rather than having these big dashboards that measure everything, it is finding those nuggets that really say how likely people are to do this activity and how likely that activity is to create impact in the world. And I love the idea of bringing playfulness into that, but I think it is important. And one of the things we talk about at Greenpeace is trying to make sure that when we're asking people to do something, that it is meaningful, both in terms of having meaning to the people that we're asking, but also that it is meaningful in creating change. And I think there's a bit of, we always ask everybody to sign a survey. You haven't seen anything that is like a petition sign. So, you know, there's always that. And it's like, but is that the right thing for this moment? Not just defaulting to the ask because it's what we've done before. And one thing that we've started asking colleagues to really think about when they're putting these out to people is, how will you feed back to the people that have taken that action that it created impact in the world? And if you can't make that link to how you would tell someone else outside the organization, what we asked you to do, this is the impact that it made in the real world, then maybe it's not the right thing that we're asking them to do. And it's finding ways to link all of those actions up and finding ways to value all the different ways that people can support us.
Oh, absolutely. I think that asking your community members to take a meaningful action is part of that relationship building. And this really ties into the next question. So many of us on the call right now have either are current fundraisers or have a background in fundraising. And we've had a couple questions about the tie between engagement activities and fundraising. I think that this also is very top of mind when we consider a lot of organizations responding to coronavirus, the global pandemic. We had a question that wondered if people would experience, or organizations would experience, a dip in donations if we're focusing on engagement activities, saying that, you know, oh, you're asking me to do too many different things and I don't want to engage with you in the future and make a donation. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. And I know that a lot of the best practices would say, hey, it's actually the opposite, but is that true in practice? I'm throwing it out to the panelists.
I think that's definitely something that I saw working in agencies before coming to Greenpeace, where you could measure, and often that would be much more fundraising led. If you had your donors who had also ticked the box of doing some other campaigning action, or returning a story. Maybe it was on the back of a donation form. Often you would see their sort of lifetime value increasing, so they would stay longer and typically tend to do more. I think, again, it comes back to that sense of being meaningful. It's not getting people to do things because you think that will make them a more valuable person. People who care about your issue and are willing to do more things for you are likely to stay longer and do more because they want to create that impact. And I think as long as we are able to demonstrate that impact to people and ask them to do meaningful things, then those who do more for us, those who take those opportunities, are likely to be where we want to focus our time and our effort and our energy, because those are the people who care, those are the people who have passion, those are the people who, when we have a situation like we do at the moment and they're looking at all of their expenses and all of the organizations that they choose to support, they choose to keep supporting us and maybe cut some of the other things away because they have that passionate and engaged relationship. So for me, if you're asking the right people to do the right things, then you will build that engagement, and therefore it won't be an issue.
Do you think some of this disconnect? Oh, sorry, Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, if I can just jump in, I think the analogy I often think about for this is, you could walk into, if you just wanted to raise some money quickly for, a charity activity that you're doing, you could probably walk into a big cocktail party of people you never met before, make a compelling pitch and get a bunch of donations. And you could equally ask a bunch of your friends and say, I'm doing this bike ride across the country to raise some money for this charity. Could you please donate? The difference then becomes, but then let's say you're now in all kinds of trouble. You're having, you've lost your home to a fire and you need real help, a lot of money, support, other kinds of things. Who are the people you can then count on, right? And to me, it's the people then you turn to, those relationships that you've invested in for years. Those are the people who are most likely to respond, to stand with you when your organization, when you're having questions of, existential questions like many organizations are facing now. It's the people who you've spent time with them, you celebrated their birthdays, not because you thought later you would have to ask them for more money, but because you were genuinely building a relationship and building a deep, establishing and engaging with them for multiple other reasons and at a human level. And I think it's a similar thing with supporter development.
Do you think that some of this disconnect between or concern, and I've certainly experienced it myself in the nonprofit sector, this concern that if we do too many activities where we might be missing out on fundraising type activities, or even having those two programs be completely separate? Do you think some of that comes back to again, tracking and assessment, and not looking at the person who ultimately donated? What kinds of other things did they do for our organization before they reached the point where they gave, or before they fundraised for us, or something like that? Is there, I hate to come back to like, is there a magical tool that will do everything for us? But is that a system that organizations should consider putting in place to look at the past activities, that you could, create that kind of funnel of engagement and see if there is a quantitative number at the end of the day towards all the different engagement activities that you do?
I'll jump in quickly. I think you're touching on something that I think is a critical issue here, which is the question of the tools and the technology. And I think they've made us a little bit lazy in some regard, in that they highlight automatically, a lot of these platforms, certain metrics, and they stop at those easy to measure metrics, right? And they built in all the things that they can easily automatically track or measure, right? Like signups and the 1 or 2 or 3 standard action tools that everyone can use. But any organization, I think, worth their salt is asking people to do more than just those 2 or 3 things when it comes to, because they need people to do more than that to actually achieve their mission, right? Whether it's, showing up and taking action in person or organizing other people to do things. And so those are the things that are particularly harder to measure. And I think that's where, in a time and resource constrained environment, we don't have that extra conversation to say, how are we going to figure out, other than someone's Excel thing over on the side, how we capture in our larger system that the fundraisers are using, other divisions and departments are using, the 50 people that actually went to 50 different grocery stores for the last 3 weekends to set up a table and recruit other members, or to go into the grocery store to ask the store manager to, you know, change their supply chain or something like that. Those people, those are the people that we're thinking about in this kind of report, and that our systems don't necessarily set up well, and that we need to spend more time figuring out, is there some way for us to simply, you know, add that custom field or come together internally around what that data point could look like, so that we can integrate them into the planning and the thinking.
We've had a couple questions about the role of storytelling in impact reporting. And I think we all know, sort of, if you have a background in communications, that it's always better, you know, if you're trying to persuade a stakeholder, you're trying to talk to your audience, to tell the story of one person who had a great impact, as opposed to saying 40 million, you know, or using big numbers like that. That's always persuasive. When it comes to impact reporting, do you have any examples or recommendations for how to work storytelling in? Because I think when it comes to a qualitative discussion, storytelling is like a weapon for you, right? Because you aren't going to be building an Excel spreadsheet, right?
I'm going to jump in with something a little maybe controversial. So I think impact measurement and impact reporting are actually quite different, and kind of totally different types of data. Qualitative, quantitative could be totally different, because to me, impact measurement is actually about management, and it's actually about increasing the effectiveness of an organization. And it's you understanding how you're progressing to the goals you want to achieve. That's impact measurement to me. That's how do big it is impact measurement. And you definitely want to have broad data. You don't want to be looking anecdotally, right? If you're communicating, doing impact communication, you're trying to persuade, you're trying to create an emotional response in a supporter or a funder. And then it is totally appropriate to go into a deep dive, case study, beautiful pictures, maybe make a video. So I guess I do want to draw a distinction between the two. And I would not want people to be using anecdotes to try to manage. And also, it might not be useful to be using impact output metrics or input metrics to try to persuade a funder or a supporter to take some action. So, but then I'm sure there's probably some advice about storytelling as well from Joe and Michael.
I think you're completely right. I think the storytelling can help us with the why are we doing this, and can be that inspiration, but it doesn't give you that nitty gritty of the kind of the what and the how, and the numbers to kind of build that through. And I still remember when our UK office sent round details of an old lady who had been on the database for a very long time, who had given in multiple different ways, and sent in this wonderful email where she had been sent out a campaigning ask by some of our colleagues, and she had stickers to put onto cans of tuna. And she sent in this wonderful story about going down the aisles and sticking it on and almost being caught by a security guard, and how she'd never been brave enough to be on the front line, but had always admired the activists, and this was her chance. And she talked about all the different ways she'd supported previously. And I found that story a really useful illustration of someone who had been engaged for a very long time, who had been inspired, who gave in multiple different ways, who was being able to kind of take some of these campaigning actions, and using that as inspiration, I think is great. And then illustrating, so if we're able to capture, you know, the kind of the equivalence within our campaigning, within our people-powered work of recency, frequency, value, tenure, the things that we know work for fundraising, but we need to find equivalents for in campaigning work, and in our sort of people power, our activism, our alliance building, then we can have those other stories, and we can see this person that has this lifetime of engagement and is still inspired and excited every day. So yeah, the why to inspire people, but the what and the how that gives us the substance that enables us to invest in the right people and the right activities to create the largest sustainable impact in the real world.
You've definitely given us a picture that I'm going to remember. So, I mean, that's a great illustration for the audience there, right? It was just a 3-minute story that's really going to stick with you. We had another question about narratives that sort of ties into this, and how can we avoid speaking for others and not sort of falling into the savior frame? I guess this really hits at the heart of a lot of marketing communications discussion in general, and not just in how we assess impact and report on impact, but I think it's a little bit of a wider discussion in the nonprofit sector in general. And are there any thoughts on how organizations that you've worked with have addressed that?
There, there are people in Greenpeace who I would love to be on this call to be able to answer that question, because working in allyship, building narrative frames and stories up is brilliant for them. One thing I would say, and this is from my kind of pre-Greenpeace work, at one of the agencies I worked at, we had 2 organizations, and I won't name them, but one would very much use all of the tools at their disposal to drive as much fundraising income as possible, because they believed that their responsibility was to raise as much money as possible to enable them to do the work, kind of no matter what. And the other organization was very much more about kind of making sure that it was more in partnership, and that it was about that support and allyship. And I always thought that that was really important and really interesting. They raised less money. Now, I think that that's there, but again, it's that understanding what your mission is, and having those conversations with board members to say, these are the realistic impacts of that, but actually these are the reasons that we're doing it, and backing that up so that they understand that investment, but the other ways that you're getting out, because otherwise you get caught in the numbers debate rather than actually the mission that we're looking to deliver. And coming back to that mission, coming back to that theory of change, why do we exist? And therefore, are we measuring the right things? And are they giving us a true picture of the impact that we're having in the world?
I have up on the screen all of your details right now, which hopefully you're able to see. Again, chat in the chat box if you're having any issues with the video or the audio, because I know that we have a slew of questions, and thank you so much for being the most engaged audience. I'm really appreciative. And a lot of your questions are pretty specific. So I've put the details up here in case you would like to reach out to any of our experts and ask them that question directly and maybe get a little bit of illumination. I'm also going to throw up, oh, that was a beautiful slide that was going to be a background that I completely forgot about, but what use is a bunch of hands on a keyboard, right? You know, it's nice to look at, but then we move on to the actual useful stuff for you. Our panelists have a couple actions that you can take if you're interested in this topic and you want to learn a lot more. So Mary at Do Big Good, they have impact webinars. So sign up at the link above there and you can get more information about the work that they do. Get on the Dispatch newsletter for MobLab and you'll get tons of great information just like this. Joe's talked about a lot of the work Greenpeace does, and I've been creeping you guys on every possible mailing list for a long time, looking for copy and ideas and things that I can copy and use and share with my students. Obviously, my students see examples all the time, especially that 40 Years of Victories video. That's an amazing one. I know it's a oldie but a goodie. And of course, more webinars and more topics about donor acquisition, supporter engagement, email marketing, and all that great stuff that Care2 has for you. Check out care2services.com. What I would like to do now, just as before we end, is I want to throw it out to our panelists. Is there anything that on this topic or in this report that we didn't get to talk to that you feel should be highlighted? So that was maybe your favorite insight or something that we didn't talk about that you think would be a good takeaway for the audience? Excellent, we are perfect. We covered every possible topic on this webinar. There was one question which I will throw out for those of you who are still on the call, and it's about capacity in doing reporting. This is a time we're all very stretched right now. I know everyone's sick of hearing the term unprecedented, but it is an unprecedented time. We're all trying to work away from our usual teams. Sometimes we are away from our usual software platforms or tech and all that kind of stuff. And we've got got a million extra things to do. What's your recommendation on capacity and staffing?
I mean, the main thing, I guess, my first reaction on seeing some of the comments or questions here, just about, isn't it a luxury to be thinking about all these ways to measure, track people power? I think, yes, if we get really creative and bespoke, perhaps, obviously there's additional resource implications, but there are a lot of ways to standardize and just say, like, if we look at presidential campaigns are obviously up and coming right now in the United States. There's a lot of ways where you kind of scale, and Mary obviously comes from that background, but like, there's many ways to, for example, for us to identify, hey, this is a specific clear role that we're going to define and we're going to put out there, and we're going to say, here's what a neighborhood team leader looks like. And we're just going to count the number of people who are able to step into those roles, or in an emergency response situation, who's able to do, these are the roles and responsibilities. This is part of effective movement building work, is really clearly defining, communicating, what does it mean if you're in a certain role. And so if your role is to be a social media volunteer captain for coordinating certain part of a mutual aid response, then we identify who's in that, you find a way to simply, not complicate it for yourself, but simply identify who's in what roles and what does it mean to be in that role or not in that role. And we can count and track, are we have more people moving into those roles or not? And so I'd say let's make, in resource and time constraint, let's simplify the work for ourselves, instead of trying to measure like a beautiful painting and all the different colors in it of people power.
And another thought that I would have too is, if there are leaders or stakeholders who are on this call and are suddenly thinking, oh, my organization should be doing this, or jumping into this, that maybe rather than sort of pushing that work downwards, maybe you could lead by example, and see what you can do to pull together an assessment, or think about the goals that you want to reach and how you want to report on them, as opposed to sort of tasking that to yet another team. So I think that that's an important insight as well. All right, I really want to thank everyone for joining us today and hanging on up past 3. This has been a great webinar. I want everyone to know that you will receive contact information for all of our wonderful experts. You will receive a link to the report that you can download, and a copy of this webinar. Again, cross fingers for the tech on this one. You should be getting a link to the video all in one day. And we hope that you will join us in the future for other webinars like this one. I really want to thank my wonderful panelists. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Mary. And thank you, webinar wizard Emma, for your help on the behind the scenes. So we're going to stop.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks everyone for coming. Stay in touch.
Thank you. I hope it was useful.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care, everyone.